here and examined it in its heyday, all this would have been covered in gold.
The stones still bear traces of their additional adornment.
And here you can see still the remains of that gold the king would have seen. And he would have been able to view these magnificent reliefs in which they would have literally shone in golden sunlight. This relief shows his grand army on the march. They're travelling through a thick forest, and the great war elephants here each carry one of his generals. But below here we see the Khmer army, the infantry. Look at them. They are absolutely proud, erect, and in great military order.
This army was vital to Suryavarman's survival and the prosperity of his new empire. When he seizes the crown, Suryavarman launches attacks to extend his empire into Vietnam and Myanmar, soon covering 360,000 square kilometers. But the empire was so enormous, it took hundreds of thousands of workers to build and maintain. How would Suryavarman feed them all? The answer can be found about 20 kilometers south of Angkor Wat, in the Tonle Sap Lake. The lake is connected by the Tonle Sap River to the Mekong. But in the summer, the volume of tropical rains combined with runoff from the Himalayas pushes up the Tonle Sap River into the lake, drowning forests of trees and quadrupling in size. And when the lake retreats, vast plains are covered with fertile earth for rice cultivation. Suryavarman's subjects cultivate 2 and sometimes even 3 harvests of rice a year. Not only can Suryavarman feed his workers, but there is also surplus production. While much of the world is practicing subsistence agriculture, Suryavarman generates revenue to pay for mega projects like Angkor Wat and for wars against his neighbors. Just as one cannot conceive of the Egyptian empire without the Nile, the great floodplain of the Tonle Sap feeds the growth of the Khmer kingdom and a mega city at its heart. The scope and scale of the Khmer Empire means that Suryavarman's workers have many great building traditions to draw from as they construct the temple. The height of the 1,532 columns means that the stone-on-stone friction is not enough to keep the features of the temple safely in place. Suryavarman's engineers rely on another great building tradition, carpentry.
The temples themselves were all constructed in stone, but the people lived in homes made of wood. They were great woodworkers. We know what the houses and palaces looked like because we have them represented on some of their stone reliefs.
Looking at these pieces of carved stone, it is clear how woodworking influenced the way the stone was cut and carved.
You can see how they were decorated and chiseled away in just the same way that the wood was chiseled into patterns and forms.
The techniques of joining the stones show a similar influence.
You can see the way that the timber would have been a prototype to the way in which the stone was also cut so that you have neat and mortise and tenon jointing. And so the woodworker and the stoneworker were working in harmony one with the other.
Based on their knowledge of how shapes interlocked and exploiting the natural weight and friction between stones, Suryavarman's teams produced the soaring details that make Angkor Wat famous. This extends to the roof of the structure as well. As the walls of the great temple near completion, they appear to ignore one of the most elemental and effective building techniques available, the keystone arch. This could be because the arch creates its own engineering problems.
Everyone knows that the arch is a wonderful structural device. It's very efficient, it's used all over the place, but it does have some downsides. And one of the downsides that the arch has is that in order to work, it has to resist big pushes out at the end. So if I have an arch like this, it wants to go like that, and it pushes out like my elbows are going out there. And so you need to apply large horizontal thrusts at the end.
To get around this problem, the distinctive tops of the towers at Angkor Wat are examples of a building technique called corbelling.
with small kids with blocks would have seen in action many times, and it involves the placing of a block and then another one slightly offset from it, another one slightly offset from it, to a point where the thing begins to span out.
Unlike European structures such as cathedrals, whose roofs had to span large spaces, Khmer architecture favors corridors and small meeting rooms. This made corbelling a viable alternative.
It's sometimes dangerous, and mistakes have been made by architects who come from Europe and look at it and go, what do you mean there's no radiating joint in an arch? The joints are flat. That's mad. That's not structurally, that isn't in my engineering manual. It doesn't work. Wait a minute, we've got the biggest stone temple in the world. Nobody else has built anything bigger. It must work.
So by playing to the specific needs of their temple, the Khmer constructed countless corbelled structures, creating their own distinctive architectural style. But as they complete the temple mountain, the sand core pushes out against the laterite and sandstone encased walls. The outward thrust might have started to push it out of shape. The Khmer would have to implement a solution, or else the entire structure will crumble into a heap of sand and stone blocks.
Most building in stone is trial and error. When they were building the Gothic cathedrals, they would very often build them as high as they could before they started to fall down. And that was as high as they could get, and then they'd stop.
The tons of sand contained within the laterite forms are pushing constantly against the stone. Suryavarman's engineers will need to reinforce the laterite walls and keep their soaring temple mountain intact. Their solution takes the modern visitor to the most sacred part of the Angkor Wat site, once off limits to anyone but the highest priests.
These steps must rank amongst the steepest in the world, and it would have been very, very hard for an old priest or an old king even to get up them. In fact, one has to go up them almost pigeon-toed to make it to the top. But on the right and the left-hand sides, there are these great buttresses, and these buttresses are almost certainly weight-bearing to take the enormous thrust of the weight of the stone and to distribute it as you come down so that the building would in fact last, and it has, for almost 1,000 years.
At almost exactly the same time that the French architects of Chartres used their flying buttresses, Khmer engineers adopt a similar principle. Thrust met by counter-thrust, half a world away in Southeast Asia. Yet before visitors to the site see the soaring Temple Mountain, they must first cross its famous moat. Damien Evans argues that the moat and temple are in fact two separate feats of engineering.
You have the construction of the temple, which would have itself taken probably decades and involved hundreds of thousands of people, and then all around outside of that temple you have an equally impressive feat, which is the construction of this moat, and again would have involved the labor of hundreds of thousands of people over the course of many decades.